Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Much appreciated that you're here, and I think we have a great time tonight. This lecture is about 5 myths about science and faith. I do this lecture for more than 10 years now, and I love discussions afterwards. So there's more than ample of time. I try not to be too long. I just try to feed you some information, some challenges to think about. But most importantly is if you have questions afterwards, there's more than enough time. So 5 myths. Facts always win. Science is objective. Dinosaurs died out 60 million years ago. Selection explains complexity, and the Big Bang is evident. I'm going to touch on them during the lecture, not in a chronological order, but I'm going to touch on them. If you have questions afterwards, you're more than welcome to come. So this is the chronological order of the topics I want to go to. First, a little bit about myself, then some findings that might contradict the common ideas in science, dating dinosaurs, a little bit about faith, what is that, a conclusion, and afterwards we have time for questions. So let's talk a little bit about me, to give a little bit about my background. I studied aerospace engineering. This bike was the result of my internship. I think I spent more than 1.5 years on that. I got started, normally it's like 6 months or so, but it was so much fun. Designed the software to basically design a trike that's has a very low drag. Tested this in the wind tunnel, and I didn't build this prototype, but the company did, and they tried to market it. It was a lot of fun. My master thesis, I did at Shell, at the Faculty of Applied Mathematics, and it was about computing basically the probability that certain layers in the Earth had cracked and leaked oil, and there were some mathematical challenges there. So that was my internship. So we're going to talk about science and faith tonight, and to get a common ground and a common understanding what I mean about science, what we mean about science. I have some examples to explain what I'm trying to talk about. So here's the first example I came across. And this is a very interesting story. It's a Dutch story from Wagenaar in 1580. So he was a captain on the sea, and basically what he did, he collected coastal data. So in that time, if you were sailing with your ship, there was a little bit of information available. There were no maps, or almost no maps. There were little booklets there, but you ran a high risk of crashing your ship on a coast because you didn't know. So what he started to do is collect coastal data, basically like a scientist, and he used all kinds of instruments for that. He collected them, made maps from them. That was his innovation. And then what he did is he gave these maps to other captains and said, okay, go check them out. And so he refined those maps, and he published a book. It's called the First Spiegel der Zeevaart. And it was a first publication with maps in them, and it was very, very successful. So I use this to illustrate this process of science, basically collecting data and then giving them to other people to inspect. And at that time it was very simple because it was visual inspection, and the science in the 1600s, 1700s was a lot about visual observation, eyewitnesses writing down data and sharing the data with other people. So if we go to the 21st century, then we can see that science has progressed a lot. There was an interesting article I came about. And it says, earthquakes suggest Earth's core has started spinning more slowly. So the idea is that the Earth is made up of layers. We live on the crust here, and internally is a solid piece of metal, iron and nickel. That's what the hypothesis is. And the idea is based on the earthquake data that we collect on the surface. We think that this core may be spinning not in the same speed as the outer core. So I use this as an illustration, not to go into the science. This was published in Nature very recently. And to explain a little bit how we get to these results. So earthquakes happen. This is data from 1900 to 2017. Earthquakes happen all over the place. And then these earthquakes travel through the Earth, along the surface. Some are going through the core. And then we have like monitoring stations all over the globe. And they are basically monitoring when these signals arrive at the other part of the Earth. We use seismographs. Well, maybe you have seen those in school, or they use the old pen, and nowadays they look like this. So this is basically the data that's collected for decades now, and that's used as input for that survey. Other types of data that we collect about the internal of the Earth to generate basically the waves ourselves, for instance by ships that send signals, and then we look at the reflection and basically try to model the layers that are there. We do drilling. I have an example later on. This is a ship, it's a Japanese ship, the Chikyu, very modern ship, and they drill into the Earth and collect samples there. But also what we do, we measure the magnetic field. We can do that on the Earth itself. We use satellites for that and try to monitor the magnetic field. These are all kind of samples of things, data that we collect. And just like the example with the captain that was looking at where is the coastline, this is the data that we collect. So for instance, for these cores, when we collect them, we try to do a chemical analysis of them. This is a machine that basically separates all the atoms based on their weight, and then we could try to do a chemical analysis on this. So this is all data gathering. And when we go back here to this example, we do data gathering, but we can't go into the Earth itself. Unlike the example of the captain that was sailing along coast and measuring where the coastlines were and giving these maps to other captains, and they could do a visual inspection. It's difficult to do a visual inspection. It happens only in the movies, right? But we can't get there. So what we get, and this is the point I'm trying to make, we have to assume, we have to make assumptions what is in there. And so we do that based on the magnetic field that we measure on the outside. We do that based on the seismic analysis that we do. We do that based on the earthquake data, but it is a hypothesis. And so when you read about this scientific research, so one team is coming to completely different conclusions about the rotation speed of the inner core than another scientific team. So, and this is normal science, right? So this is the point I'm trying to make. This is normal science. This is how science should happen. Debating whether certain assumptions are better than other assumptions, whether they fit the data better. There are some that say, okay, the difference in travel speed through the core are not caused by the fact that this is spinning, but it's caused by what's happening here on the intersections of these layers. So there are all kind of different interpretations. This is perfectly valid science, and this is how science should go and how the debate should go. Different assumptions. So we collect a lot of data, but we can't inspect the object that we're measuring directly. So we have to infer what's happening there. So another, as part of the introduction, the other point I would just want to briefly mention is the question, where did the idea of an old Earth come from? I found out that a lot of confusion is about this subject. People think that we measure the age of the Earth directly, but the idea, one of the guys that was proposing this idea of an old Earth was William Smith. He was a geologist. And basically what his job was is to dig canals in England. And so these canals were dug so that coal that was mined could be transported over long distances. So, and basically what he did is inspected the layers in the Earth there. And what he needed, and also what he found is a lot of fossils. So basically remains of animals and plants that have turned to stone, have been fossilized. And so he found out these fossils there, and he found also kind of layers in the Earth, and some layers coal, some stone, different types of stone. And he was interested in how do I travel all over England, because that was his job, thousands of miles to survey all these coal mines and dig these canals. And so the question that he had is, how do I know which layer, when I dig here, corresponds to which layer there? And so basically his idea was, okay, I see these fossils, and when I see the same fossils, I assume that it's the same layer. So this is where the idea of an old Earth came from. He was one of the guys, there was a French guy, Cuvier, that was proposing the same idea, and there's the idea came from, okay, the fossils represent different layers. So you can classify a layer by its fossils that are in there, and the fossils, they have evolved from a very simple living being to very complex forms. And so this is where the idea came from, and I'm gonna come back to this point later. So this was the introduction. Here is H.D. Edberg, I think it was in the 60s. He says here in a quote, "Fossils have furnished through the record of the evolution of life on this planet an amazingly effective key to the relative position of strata in widely separated regions." And this, basically this idea that we use fossils to classify which layer we are in, and also which age we are in, is still used today. That's not a complete story, and I'll add to that later, but it's still a very important idea today. So this is where the idea of an old Earth came from. So, and then I want to give some challenges to these ideas. And one example is diamonds. And so we find diamonds very deep in the Earth, and they are brought up to through pipes, for instance, and they travel to the Earth, and at one time they come above. And we use radiometric dating to try to date rocks. We try to use radiometric dating to. We also use that to date diamonds. Now, how does it work? Some rocks contain radioactive elements, and over time they will decay into non-radioactive elements through processes. Now, and when we measure the amount of radioactive elements in there, and when we also measure the amount of decayed material in there, it works basically like an hourglass. And so if we make assumptions on the initial amount, and we see the amount that's in here, and we have the rate of decay, then we can start to count. And this is how radiometric dating works. But the point is that I want to make is there are assumptions in this process. And those are not very often mentioned. And the assumptions are that we know the initial conditions, that we know the decay rate, and that we know the historical conditions, so what happened over time. And what's now very interesting, that if we use the classical radioactive dating on stones, on rocks, then we come to ages of millions, and many, you all heard about that. But if we use the carbon dating on diamonds, then we find carbon in these diamonds, radioactive carbon. And that's very interesting because a radioactive carbon has a half-life of around 5,000 years. And so, to illustrate this a little bit, if all the Earth would be radioactive carbon, then after 1 million years, there would not be a single atom left. Right? So, if we find radioactive carbon in these diamonds, and so that's what you see here. So they did an analysis, and they found radioactive carbon in diamonds. Then the conclusion would be that these diamonds are not, they could never be more than 1 million years old. And that's a very interesting thing. Because diamonds, why are they so interesting? Because once this radioactive carbon is in there and the diamond is formed, it's fixed. It's not possible for elements, for instance, from the outside, water that's going in there. it's not it's not penetrating this diamond anymore. So you have to try to explain where this radioactive carbon comes from, and then you can start a big scientific debate about, for instance, that a possibility could be radioactivity in the neighborhoods, other decay processes which generate this radioactive carbon, and then you have arguments, okay, that's never enough. I would like to try to give this to you as a challenge, to think about this. So, okay, so we have one assumption that says, okay, we use, for instance, uranium-lead dating, and we use it on rocks, and we come to billions of years or millions of years. And we have another type of dating that says, okay, this can never be a million years old. And then the question is, which assumptions are correct? And I think that's a very important to think about. And this is just one indication that there could be more at stake than what we think there is. More unexpected findings. Here is an example of amber, and it has caught a lot of different types of animals and also a shell. So there is a spider in there, a fly, a wasp, a beetle, a cockroach, and so basically a coniferous tree, when it breaks, you have this kind of resin that comes from that. Maybe you have ever seen that. And then you have to think about, okay, there is resin flowing from a tree, which is located on land. It's flowing down from this tree, and it needs to catch all these different types of animals in there. And not only these animals, but they come from very different regions, from their very different areas where they live. And there is also a shell in there. And so here was an article, I think it was from 2019, and it says, it made a conclusion, it's rare to find aquatic organisms, so like a shell in there in amber, and it's extremely rare to find marine organisms in amber, let alone macroscopic marine organisms mixed with intertidal, terrestrial, and potentially freshwater. So basically what it's saying here is all different animals from all kinds of different regions are caught in this amber, and you have to try to explain it. And how did they get together? Now, looking from a perspective of millions of years of slowly changing circumstances, and this is a challenge. But if you look at like look at an Earth history of 6,000 years, and what the Bible says, there was a big global flood where there were a lot of trees destroyed, they were moved to the water, and a lot of animals were on the water, and this resin was flowing there. It's actually, it's experimentally shown that resin that flows in the water can capture animals, and sometimes these pieces of resin are super big, like a meter or so. And they can catch, and so that's another possible explanation how these animals get in there. And so what I want to show is, so we collect all kind of data, rocks, like these pieces of ambers, fossils, but there are different explanations possible. Another example that I would like to show you is this is the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And it's near the border of Norway, completely in the north there. And it was built in the 1970s. And what the Russians wanted to do is they wanted to beat the Americans in making the biggest hole in the earth. So I think the American record was at 9 kilometers that they drilled into the earth. And so it was in the time of the Cold War. There was a lot of competition between these superpowers going on. And so they wanted to drill deeper there. And they spent more than 20 years on that. I have some pictures. You see these guys drilling. I think on the top, it was like 90 centimeters wide. And ultimately, it went down to 12 kilometers in the earth. And here is a celebration picture when they reached 12 kilometers, and their goal was to reach 15 kilometers depth. Well, why I'm telling this story? Because the surprising find was, while they were drilling, that when they were 7 kilometers deep, they found water. And why is that interesting? Because no one ever predicted there would be water there. So you have to understand the traditional understanding of the formation of the Earth is that billions of years ago, the Earth was a molten rock. And here we have like water that's captured at 7 kilometers depth. And so you have to try to explain it. It was not predicted by the models that they had now. And why is this interesting? Because if we read the Bible, then it says that when the Noah's flood started, that the water came from the depths of the earth. So there are, and then again, so this is like the data that we collect. We see water. These are the facts that we collect, and then there are different interpretations possible how this water got here. And actually now scientists believe that there are some areas that are like complete oceans that are captured in the layers in the earth. So there's a lot of water there. But we have a lot of difficulty drilling so deep. And ultimately they could not get further than 12 kilometers because it simply got too hot. It was like 200 degrees. And what they were finding out is that when we find a piece of rock, it's very hard, right? But at 12 kilometers deep, this rock was like plastic. So this hole, it just flowed. They could not keep it open, and finally the funding stopped, and they stopped drilling. So this is an interesting fact which I wanted to show you, which is open for multiple interpretation. Here's another very interesting fact. Is that when we go into the sea and we look at the sea floor all over the world, we find the rivers there. And sometimes hundreds of meters deep. And so these rivers, they look exactly like rivers that are on top of the earth, that are above the water. And this is not just in one location, there are hundreds of locations all over the earth. Where there's just a river flowing. But you can understand when you're on the surface level and a river is flowing and it's moving along stones and sand and it's making shores and stuff like that. On top of the earth we have gravity and water is flowing, but down here we have not. So what we're actually seeing is rivers, and they look the same. The only thing that's not here underwater are trees. They don't grow underwater, they only grow on top. So, and then again, these are the facts that we collect, and then there are multiple interpretations possible. You can try to explain why these rivers can form underwater. You can also say, well, it's possible that these rivers were at one time above the water. And this is, again, what the Bible is saying, that after the flood, the mountains rose up and the sea went down. And that is an explanation for why we see rivers above, and basically they're continuing below the surface. And if you couple that with the fact that the water before the flood was in below the crust of the earth, then you get another explanatory model of how the world looks like today and what we see today and what we see. Another point that I would like to look at is dating dinosaurs. Not going out with them, but measuring how old they are. I would not suggest you to date a dinosaur because I think that's not good for your health. You'll probably be the meal. So in recent decades, we found exquisite, very, very, very nice examples of dinosaurs. This one is called a nodosaur, and the features of his skin are perfectly preserved, and you can see what he looked like. This ichthyosaur, it was even more interesting because the chemical remains of his skin were still there, the pigments, and so that's interesting. So how can this material remain intact for so long? And there are more questions like this. So I think it was in the 2000s that Mary Schweitzer, she was investigating T-Rex bones. And one story that I read said, okay, they were collecting these T-Rex bones, and they, you can imagine they're huge, they're meters long. They put them in a truck, but they were so long they were sticking out. So they had to break them in pieces. And then what happened is that when they broke them, is they smelled. Well, that's interesting, because they're supposed to be millions of years old. So how can they smell still? But then when they started to investigate further, what they found is soft tissue. So here remains of blood vessels and other tissue that, and so there was a lot of scientific debate. Is this really dinosaur tissue, or is this bacteria that came in there? I have a short video that explains it a little bit more.
This is a fragment of a Triceratops horn. When we pulled it out of the ground, it fragmented, and then of course we've had to continue to fragment it in order to do analysis of it. In 2012, the Creation Research Society sponsored Mark Armitage and I to go to the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, which is a very popular place for finding dinosaur bones, and we instead dug out a almost 4-foot-long Triceratops brow horn. Now, it's just in crumbled pieces now, so we can't really, put it together and show you a horn. But yeah, you have to recognize that pieces such as this, we have found tissue with cells.
Oh, that's amazing.
And potentially proteins such as collagen. It's so difficult to understand how you could have this material still in a dinosaur fossil that is supposed to be 65, 75, 80 million years of age, because tissue, cells, proteins break down. They're not concrete, they don't just exist for eons of time, they break down. And in fact, they tend to break down fairly quickly depending upon the conditions. And certainly in Hell Creek, the conditions would be warm up, cool down, warm up, cool down. And any biochemist can tell you that is the fastest way to destroy material. It's difficult enough to envision it surviving for 4,000 or 5,000 years, but 60 million years, 70 million years, see, that really becomes very difficult to make any kind of biochemical basis for how it could have survived.
Okay, so once you find a sample like this, what do you do next?
So what we do is we soak the fossil material in a solution called EDTA. And what you'll have after you dissolve the fossil is the tissue will be remaining, because the EDTA won't dissolve the tissue. So then I'll bring this over to what we call a dissection microscope. This is, in essence, dissolved Triceratops horn magnified. And so you can see what it looks like, just kind of little pieces of rock.
Well, Kevin, what did you find then when you were looking at the sample and you actually found some tissue?
Okay, here's what we found. This is actually Triceratops tissue. It's stretchable, it's pliable, it's not an impression of the soft parts of the dinosaur. This is truly soft, it is squishy, it is stretchable, it is tissue.
That blows your mind, huh?
Absolutely. And if you look at them then at a closer magnification, what we see then, this is using scanning electron microscopy, you see the extreme detail of the cells. See, in that picture, and this picture, and particularly like look at this picture, we would not begin to expect to see such enormous and elaborate detail. I mean, these structures are incredibly small. This is our 20 micron bar here. See how small these structures are, still intact. It would take very little to break those. So at best, you would expect that all that would have broken off and been long gone.
So that has to have shaken up the scientific community. What's been the response of all of this?
The initial response, when Dr. Schweitzer first published her work, which is what became very popularized in 2005, it generated a lot of response. And so initially some of the reaction was rejection. Oh, it's contamination. That's not really dinosaur. It's bacteria, because bacteria can look kind of strange sometimes. So you had a lot of proposals of what it could be. And to her credit, Dr. Schweitzer did more work. They began to find protein. You break open some of these cells. You look at the matrix these cells are attached to, and they're protein.
Okay, so once that is understood,
Yes.
then what happens? Now this is shaking it up, I guess.
That becomes part of the controversy, because clearly you're now faced with how could you explain the survival of this, the pristine survival of this, not only for so long, but in very unpristine conditions. And so then the controversy has been, how do you explain it? And if you read some of the literature, there's almost like desperation because they recognized what the implications of this could be. Now, some people would claim, well, it means nothing because we know how old they are, and therefore it just means it survived somehow, big deal. But how do you know how old they are? Well, you use methods, supposed methods of dating. Well, this is a method of dating. The tissue itself can't be discounted as part of a method of dating. So why do you say that doesn't count, but this does count? Well, it's all the paradigm drives your conclusions. The paradigm is it has to be old. Therefore, methods that give us an old fossil are what we choose. Something that doesn't give us an old fossil, like tissue, we have to reject or explain away.
So, and I can encourage you to look into this because there's quite some scientific publication around this, and you can look into the arguments from both sides and see what you think there. So, point 5 is, does science require faith? I think this is an interesting discussion because many times what I encounter is that people will say, no, science is about facts. I want to give you some challenges, some questions to think about. When we discovered the DNA, first scientists that dug into that and started to investigate what do we find in this DNA, they quickly found that parts of the DNA coded for proteins. And the idea was, okay, these proteins are basically the building blocks, and this is in your food, but it's also what you and I are made of, all kinds of different proteins, basically the building blocks of our biological life. And the idea was, okay, so parts of the DNA, basically the program code for life, they code for proteins. And then if we start with an evolutionary model, which is basically an undirected random search process in trying to find out solutions for the challenges that life gives, is that if evolution was the cause of these proteins, of these pieces of program code, then for every successful gene, basically what says for every successful piece of program code that could generate a piece of protein, it must have been accompanied by many other redundant copies, or basically what it's saying is it's a process of trial and error. And so the conclusion was, and so he wrote this in his paper, he says there is so much junk DNA in our genome. So this was basically the understanding that a big part of our genome is junk because it's the result of trial and error in the past. All right? Now what's interesting, and this again I will challenge you to read into this, is that the successor to the Genome Project, maybe you have heard about it, the Genome Project was about trying to find out how our DNA, what kind of letters are in there, 4 letters and 3.3 billion letters. And so the Genome Project was basically determining what these letters were. And then they spent a couple of decades on that, millions of dollars. And so basically they found out, I think, at some point, and they said, okay, we found the human DNA and we know what letters are in there. But then you know just what the letters are, but you don't know what it actually says. So there was a successor project, and that was called the ENCODE project. And here, Ivan Burney was the director of this project. And they started to investigate what was all these pieces of DNA, what are they doing? And so it was, I think, a 300 million research project. And one of the conclusions that he states here in his in this paper, it says it's likely that the 80% estimate of functional human DNA will go to 100%. So this is interesting. This is just research findings. And I challenge you to read into this and see both sides of the argument. So here we have I think in 1970, the idea that much of our DNA is junk. And now when we're actually looking into this DNA, we find that the big part of that is functional. And so this challenges the idea that a big part of our ideas, our DNA is junk. And then it's also challenges, how do you explain our DNA if there is almost no junk in there? So you can look it up, please. Another experiment that's very often quoted when you talk about chemical evolution, basically starting from atoms and molecules, non-living materia, how do we get to living cells? And an often quoted experiment is the Miller-Urey experiment. I think it's done in the 1950s, where they put some chemicals, and I think they put it through a system. There was lightning there, and ultimately big victory was claimed, and says, okay, we have made molecules the building blocks of life, right? This was in the 50s. And it's still often quoted in biology textbooks. But what's not often told is that the chemicals that were used in this experiment were industrially made by in factories that cost millions of dollars and have been designed by humans. And if you try to find where on Earth we would have in the past a situation where we find the chemicals in the right concentrations together, it says this may limit the geographical areas where such chemistries may occur. So you have to make plausible that the starting conditions of the experiment were even possible on Earth. And the second challenge is that the chemicals that were produced had a very short half-life, 73 minutes. So it means even though there were certain molecules produced, many of them would fall apart very shortly after that. So and if you so this is another challenge. And so I think when you take these things into account, it would be scientifically better if you present these results together with the challenges that are there, because I think they're severe. And now we're 60 years, 70 years later, and there is still no experiment that shows how chemicals can, through a random process, can form a living cell. I think you may conclude that we're even further away because now we understand more how complex life is. So the last example that I want to give you is the Large Hadron Collider near CERN in Switzerland, France. I think it crosses both countries, which is basically like a big ring where they accelerate particles, they let them crash together, and then all kind of subatomic particles are formed, and they have large machines where they analyze basically what kind of particles are generated in this crash. And so they try to understand how atoms are made. And we have the standard model for that, which basically describes how atoms work. And I think the Large Hadron Collider has been very successful in proving that the standard model works. But what I want to use this example for, if you read on their website, they say one of the purposes of the Large Hadron Collider is to recreate and investigate the circumstances just after the start of the Big Bang. That's one of the purposes. They spend like $1 billion a year on that project, and so they say this is one of the goals of this project. But the point is, and that's interesting, they say just after the start of the Big Bang, because the start of the Big Bang, where all matter was condensed in an infinitely small point, it's not something that you can test in an instrument like this. So, and if you can't test it, then the question is it outside the realm of science to investigate? because it's also not like many other natural, like rain that's falling or gravity, stuff like that, or building planes and investigating how flight works and aerodynamics. Those are recurring processes, but the start of the Big Bang is not a naturally occurring processes, and that's also true for the start of self-replicating cells. These are not naturally occurring processes. And the question is, are they open for investigation? And is it science, or is it belief that this is possible, only given natural laws? And so this is another thing I would like to give you to think about. So to come to a conclusion, and I found this a very interesting question that Gerard het Hoofd posed in a book I read, The Building Blocks of Creation. He's a Dutch Nobel Prize winner in physics from 1999. Very, very smart mathematician, one of the smartest mathematicians in the Netherlands. And he asked this very interesting question: how can it be that our human brains have been able to understand this totally alien world of the most exotic subatomic particles in so much details? And this is a question I would like you to think about. And can we really explain that using only natural laws? Is that really possible? And here is another question or a remark that JBS Haldane made. He says, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter, for if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." Right? I think these are interesting questions to think about. What is truth? How do we know that? Can we know truth? Can we reason about it? Can we debate about it? And where does it come from? Is it purely a chemical process, or is there more going on? And so what I try to do in this lecture is to give some challenges about the ruling beliefs that universe is like 13 billion years old, the Earth is like 4 billion years old, and that life has evolved, and that basically the idea that all the evidence that we collect confirm those ideas. And so I think there are a lot of challenges to those ideas. And I think it's good to think about it. And basically I would like to open up for questions. So, is there anyone that has?
I have one question about the ember stones.
Yeah.
You talked about about those ember stones containing animals from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
But
the different geographic regions. Yeah.
Yeah, from totally geographic regions, or like distances from each other, which could be.
Yeah, they have to be in one location, right? In order to be caught in this ember. So it's if it's a kilometer away, it's away from the sea, stuff like that.
Yeah, I see.
And then again, it's not that I say it's impossible, but it's the question which model explains better the things that we find. And so it's an interesting find. Yeah.
I have a question on the tissue of the found dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know what the maximum age would be for that tissue from the knowledge we have right now?
From I don't know exactly, but that should be in the thousands of years. So but then and so that's the decay rate of biological material, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be more in the thousands of years, and that would be And that's also where it's interesting to look into these papers that debate this stuff on both sides and see what kind of arguments are in there. So they will say things like, okay, there was iron present, and that iron helped to conserve it, but then again, how to prove that, right? And so for such a long, it maybe has an effect, but does it really mean that it's conserved for millions of years? Yeah. And I think, but the most important thing is that you have to investigate it for yourself. and to really look into that. And what I find is that sometimes evidence is presented a little bit one-sided, and that's what we're trying to do tonight, to give a challenge to that. So there is more. Other questions?
Yeah, one question about the ribos. The half time of ribos, it's set on the
Yeah.
screen. In one condition, it's set like 73 minutes at a certain pH level and certain temperature, but then 44 years at that temperature.
Yeah. So the temperature it's has a big influence on that.
Yeah.
How fast it breaks down.
Okay. Yeah.
So if the temperature is higher, it breaks down very fast.
Okay. Yeah.
But and that ties into the same question with the dinosaur tissue, is that the longer the biological molecules get, the higher chance you get that they break down and they get damaged. So, for instance, our DNA is very fragile. It breaks down quite easily, and you have like a lot of repair processes in place to make sure that it stays the same. And the longer many biological molecules that are in our body are very long, and they break down very quickly and very easily. And that's why cells are constantly replicating to repair themselves. Yeah, very good questions. Other opinions, questions there?
I did not pay attention very well. I was interested in the part which you were explaining about water beneath the ground, the deeper part.
Yeah, yeah, that's what they found in the Kola Peninsula. Yeah.
What is science saying about that?
Well, it's science is in that way, when they find new things, they adapt their models, right? So now they say, okay, we found it, and so we take this into account. And there are scientists that say, okay, we use water as a possibility to explain what we're actually measuring in terms of seismographic data or earthquake data that we collect, and they take that into account. And some will say, okay, there is so much water there, it's like an Arctic Sea. That's actually in the crust of the Earth there. So, but the interesting thing is, it was not expected based on the model that we had at time. And I think that's interesting because, well, that indicates, I don't want to say it's a bad model, but science is tentative, right? So we make assumptions, and we try to do our best to make those assumptions as good as possible, but they're not the truth. And my opinion is it would be very wise to, well, for instance, if you buy a car, well, the car manufacturer would like say, okay, you can use this car up to 250 kilometers per hour. If you drive 1,000 kilometers with the car, put a bigger engine in there, you're gonna get hurt, right? And I think it would be very wise to do that same with science. We say, okay, I found these results, but these and these are things that we're not sure of. But that's not always in the best interest of a scientist. Yeah.
Yeah. My question is looking at what this presentation from a slightly philosophical perspective, and from two core arguments, I would say if you trace recent or modern science world to back to the arguments of the great philosophers Aristotle and Plato, and the argument, especially from Plato, that this world is a reflection of the real world, which is not visible,
Mm-hmm.
and the forms. Then Aristotle's postulate or theory is that what we observe is the real world.
Yeah.
And then the scientific development has been along this argument of the Aristotle perspective. And how do you see this deviation from these two arguments? Trying to understand that from what Plato postulated, that the world is a reflection of the hidden world.
Yeah.
If you can explain some things like the last quote that talked about the mind.
Yeah.
Where's the mind, for example? Where
Yeah.
is it located? These are some questions, like you talk about truth.
Yeah.
Where's the truth, and how do you know what's true or not?
Yeah.
So how do you see this from the scientific perspective and the deviations from these two arguments, and how do we reconcile this from the faith and the scientific observation?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I'm not an expert on Greek philosophy, but what I know, what I read, is that modern science is very much about actually measuring stuff, right, and collecting data and trying to do that as precise as possible. They were more like free thinkers. They did not always bother so much about what is really happening in the world. That's what I know about philosophy. So, and from a scientific point of view, I think it's important to try to stay close to the data, because from a scientific point of view, if you assume just anything, well, what are you going to reason about? And I've read quite some papers and books, and people are just reasoning, fantasizing about how things could be, and then you get really lost. So personally, when I look at science, I try to, okay, what is the data that we're collecting, and what is reasonable assumptions that we can make, and then from a truth perspective, I'm a Christian, and I believe that if you look at things like truth and our personal being, that these you can find these answers in the Bible. But I personally believe that I found a great example, and that I used it in my previous lecture, and it was about Semmelweis. And he found out, he was like a director in a maternity hospital. And so what he found there is that those women, they were dying of childbed fever. And so, but he didn't know what the cause was. Like 16%, 20% of people, of women that came in there to give birth to their children, they died there. But he did not know. He only observed that they died, but he didn't know the cause. And finally, his hypothesis is that the doctors that are coming in, they came from the morgue, and they were transferring something. He did not know what it was, but they were transferring something to these women, and he forced them to wash their hands, and then the mortality rate went down. So that was very interesting, because he did not have microscopes and stuff like that. He could not really see that there were things like bacteria and viruses. He only knew that washing their hands. And so he was rejected by his fellow scientists. And part of the reason was that he was not very politically nice. He was basically accusing them of being murderers if they did not wash their hands. And so they sent him to the madhouse. But he observed something, but he could not explain it. And what I found interesting, it's much later that we got these microscopes that we could actually see what's going on. And I think when we talk about the mind and our thoughts, so we have some instruments that can monitor electric activity in our brains, but thoughts, maybe we lack the instruments to actually understand. And I think that's where we're at the limit of science and what we can actually measure. And so there are no instruments to measure truth, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge that science has limits there. And then we get into philosophy, and I think, well, personally, I chose the Bible as a revelation of truth that we cannot find out through scientific means. Yeah. Is that a little bit of an answer? Yeah. I think there are limits to what we can measure, and we should be honest about that. I think that's very important. And then, personally, that's also why we give these lectures. Then I think we would like to encourage people to look into the Bible for answers to these questions. Where I come from, where is the world coming from? Is there a God or not? And how can I find out about it? Yeah? Okay.
Maybe it's worth to mention that the book Modern Science in the Bible of Ben Horbury. Instead of reading the whole Bible, you could, and looking for science, they could read a book.
Yeah.
And it tells you about the scientific reasons behind all kind of regulations in the Old Testament. For the people that had to walk through the desert into the Promised Land 40 years, they had no idea of bacteria. There's, like you say, there's no microscope, nothing. But they could not eat that animal. But they could eat the other one. It was all defined by God. They had to bury their, their poop and everything. And if you follow everything, now we know that this guy says that this is the best way to preserve hygiene. That's a very good example of not seeing, not being able to know, but then the Bible gives seemingly the very good way of keeping hygiene.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense using the knowledge, and the interesting thing is they had this knowledge was coded in the Bible, but we cannot trace that back to the cultures that were living around them. So the interesting thing is, where does this knowledge come from? But because the Egyptians did not live like that, and the other so then you have to try to answer that question. And then and I think Ben Hobrink is also talking about the Ark of Noah, and you can look at the dimensions and that they make sense using modern science, and then you have to explain why does that make sense, and how do they know about that, and these kind of things. So yeah, that's so in closing, one of the reasons why I give this lecture is that like 25 years ago, I studied aerospace engineering, and the last 3 years of my study, I was very depressed, severely depressed, and I was looking for an answer. So I went to a psychiatrist here on the campus and had conversations, basically trying to find out why do I feel this way. And I read books about depression, trying to understand what is this and how is this solved, and I read that there's medication for that. So I went to a physician and basically got medication for that, and it went on for 3 years, and I really was looking for an answer. And basically you could say I tried the scientific answers that were available, but I did not find, it did not help me. And so medication will only suppress your feelings, and you feel kind of numbed all the time and not really experiencing emotion. So that's when I give God a chance and asked him, if you're really there, if the miracles in the Bible are true, okay, just show it to me.
You was depressed and impressed.
That's true. And I prayed a simple prayer to ask Jesus in my heart and forgive. And so it's like an experiment. I tried it out. But I can remember saying, I really need to know if this is true. I'm not going like to church doubting or some believing or trying to conjure up belief myself. I really need to be convinced. And that's also one of the reasons why I started to dig into stuff like this and say, okay, what is truth and how can I know that? And things like, are there errors in the Bible or can I rely on that? So, yeah. And that really helped me and set me free from my depression. So this is what I want to encourage people to check out, because yeah, even though we don't say it, I think there are a lot of people that are hurting inside and need help, and I think it's there. That's what I want to encourage you with. So much appreciated. There is still, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. There is coffee and tea there. I would suggest stay a little bit, chat a little bit, and if you want to attend one of our services, there are flyers there. If you want to keep in contact, you can write down your email address. That's it. Thank you very much.